If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it past 2 a.m., or maybe I finally stopped running. I still don't know which one scares me more. My name is Claire Whitmore, and for most of my life I believed distance could erase history, that if you moved fast enough, changed cities, changed names, even changed the way you breathe in silence, the past would eventually lose your trail. I was wrong. It was 2:03 a.m. when I stood in front of my apartment door in Chicago, my hand hovering over the lock like it belonged to someone else. The hallway light flickered above me, humming softly in a way that made everything feel too quiet, too aware. I told myself I was just going to step out for air, just a short walk, just enough distance to remind myself I was still in control. But control is a strange illusion when your heart already knows it's being followed. I had been running for weeks before that night, though nothing about it looked like running from the outside. New apartment, new job, new routines, all carefully built like layers of paint over something I refused to look at directly. But there were moments when reality slipped through, like the same black sedan parked too far back on the street, or the feeling that every reflection in a window was a little too aware of me. I remember stopping on the stairs that night, my fingers tightening around my phone as if it could anchor me to logic. I told myself I was imagining things, that fear has a way of inventing patterns where none exist. That's when I saw it, a faint shadow through the frosted glass panel beside my door, someone standing still on the other side like they had been there long before I arrived. My breath caught, not from panic, but from recognition I didn't want to admit. Because there are some presences that don't announce themselves. They don't need to. I slowly lowered my hand from the lock and stepped back, my pulse loud enough to drown out every rational thought I tried to hold on to. And then the knock came, not urgent, not aggressive, just calm, deliberate, as if time itself was irrelevant. 3 soft taps that didn't belong to uncertainty. They belonged to certainty. I should have run down the stairs, should have done anything except stay frozen in place. But something deeper than fear held me there, something that felt like memory disguised as instinct. The hallway air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the world had adjusted its focus. I didn't open the door. I didn't need to, because I already knew who was on the other side. And then a voice followed, low, steady, impossibly familiar through the wood, speaking my name like it had never been forgotten, like it had always been waiting to be spoken again. Claire, Ethan Callahan said softly, as if the night itself had been arranged for this exact moment. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I had been running away from him or exactly toward him all along. I did not move at first. The sound of my own breathing felt too loud in the narrow hallway, as if even the building itself was listening. The door between us was thin wood and metal, yet it felt heavier than anything I had ever tried to open in my life. I should have stepped back, should have turned toward the stairs, should have done anything that resembled logic, but my body refused to obey. Then I heard his voice again, closer now, steady in a way that did not belong to hesitation. You are still doing that thing, Ethan Callahan said softly, as if we were continuing a conversation that had never stopped, holding your breath when you are afraid. My fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe without me realizing it. I whispered, though I did not know why I was whispering. You are not supposed to be here. There was a pause, not of uncertainty, but of patience, like he had expected that exact sentence. When he spoke again, his tone did not rise or fall. It simply existed with weight. Neither are you, Claire. My name in his voice did not feel like introduction. It felt like confirmation. I pressed my forehead lightly against the door, trying to create distance from the sound. From the memory, it pulled up without permission. I'm moved, I said, more to myself than to him. I changed everything. You should not know where I am. For the first time, there was a faint shift in his silence. Not surprise, but acknowledgement. You did move, he said. You did change everything. But you did not change the pattern. My throat tightened. I forced myself to step back from the door, just enough to breathe properly. What do you want? I asked, though the question already felt wrong, too small for whatever this was. On the other side, I heard the faintest sound of movement, not approaching, not leaving, just adjusting as if he had been standing there for a long time without discomfort. I want you to stop pretending you are alone in this, he said. The words landed quietly, but they carried something I could not immediately place, not threat, not demand, something closer to certainty. I shook my head even though he could not see it. I am alone, I said, sharper now, trying to anchor myself in the only truth I had built. That is the point. Another pause followed, longer this time, and when he spoke again his voice lowered slightly, not softer, but more precise. No, he said, that was never the point. My hand dropped from the doorframe. I felt suddenly unsteady, not from fear exactly, but from the uncomfortable sense that the ground beneath my understanding was not as solid as I believed. You do not know me, I said. It came out weaker than I intended. That time, there was no immediate reply. Instead, I heard something subtle, a shift in posture, the quiet patience of someone who had already decided the outcome of a moment but was allowing it to unfold anyway. I know enough, Ethan said finally, to know you did not leave because you were finished. You left because you thought distance would protect you. My pulse quickened at that, because it was too close to something I had never said out loud. I stepped away from the door entirely now, the apartment behind me suddenly feeling smaller than before. You are wrong, I said, though the words lacked force. Then open the door, he replied calmly, and tell me that without hesitation. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. I stood there, staring at the door, realizing that for the first time since I began running, I was no longer sure what I was running from, or whether he had ever been behind me at all. I stayed frozen in front of the door, my hand hovering just inches from the lock, feeling as if the entire hallway had narrowed into a single breath I could not finish. Ethan Callahan's presence on the other side was not loud, not forceful, but it filled every space where silence should have been. I told myself I had survived worse moments than this, moments where uncertainty felt like a physical weight, but none of them had felt so precise, so personally arranged. My fingers finally touched the cold metal of the lock, and I realized my hesitation was no longer about fear of him, but fear of what I might find if I confirmed he was real. Slowly, almost against my own will, I turned the key. The sound of the mechanism unlocking felt too final, like a decision that could not be undone once made. I opened the door just enough to see him. He stood exactly where he had been, not leaning, not impatient, simply waiting as if time had no authority over him. The hallway light behind me cast a thin line across his face, revealing calm eyes that did not search for permission to be there. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice was lower than before, not softer, but more grounded. You are not running from strangers, he said. My throat tightened at the simplicity of it. I tried to respond, but nothing came out immediately. He continued without stepping forward. You are running from familiarity. I shook my head slightly, instinctively rejecting the way his words seemed to map onto something I had never fully named. You do not know anything about me, I said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. His gaze did not change. I know what patterns look like when someone has been taught to disappear, he replied. The phrase struck something I did not want to acknowledge. I opened the door a little wider without realizing it, just enough for him to be visible from the shoulders down to the faint edge of his coat. If you know so much, I said quietly, then why are you here now? For the first time, his expression shifted, not into emotion, but into something more deliberate, like choosing honesty without surrendering control. Because you stopped responding the way you used to, he said. The answer unsettled me more than silence would have. I stepped back into the apartment, not inviting him in, but not closing the door either. He remained outside, respecting the threshold as if it mattered. The space between us felt less like distance and more like structure, something defined rather than accidental. I do not have a past that concerns you, I said, though the words felt thinner now. Ethan's eyes lowered briefly, not to the floor, but to the space between us, as if measuring something invisible. That is not what you told yourself when you left, he said. My chest tightened at that, because I had never told anyone what I told myself. The quiet stretched again, but this time it was different. It was not empty. It was waiting. Finally, I asked, almost reluctantly, what do you want from me? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past me into the apartment, into the life I had built as a barrier, and when he spoke, his voice carried something steadier than before. I want you to understand that you never actually escaped anything, he said. You only moved closer to the point where it ends. I stood just inside the doorway without realizing I had stopped moving at all, as if my body had decided to wait for instructions my mind had not yet agreed to receive. Ethan Callahan remained on the other side of the threshold, calm in a way that made everything around him feel slightly misaligned, like the world had been adjusted around his presence rather than the other way around. I tried to focus on something simple, the sound of the hallway vent, the faint hum of distant traffic, anything that could pull me back into the reality I had constructed for myself. But every detail now felt secondary to him, standing there speaking, as if time had already accounted for this moment long before I arrived in it. "You keep saying I never escaped," I said finally, my voice lower than I intended, controlled only through effort. "But I left everything behind." Ethan's gaze stayed steady, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply observing as though my words were pieces of data he had already expected to hear. "You left locations," he replied. "You did not leave connections." The sentence lingered between us, heavy but not aggressive, and I felt something tighten in my chest that was not fear exactly, but recognition of something I had carefully avoided naming. I turned slightly away from him, stepping deeper into the apartment as if distance inside the room could replace the distance I thought I had already created in my life. "I do not have connections," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I could hear the lack of certainty in them. Ethan did not follow me further in, but his presence followed anyway, anchored at the doorway. "That is not accurate," he said calmly. "You have been disconnected, not absent." I exhaled slowly, pressing my hand against the edge of the kitchen counter as if grounding myself physically could stabilize the feeling building in my thoughts. "Why are you talking like you know me?" I asked. For the first time, something subtle shifted in his expression, not emotion, but acknowledgement of timing, as if a boundary had been reached in the conversation that required careful response. "Because I did not arrive tonight by accident," he said. My attention sharpened immediately at that. I turned back toward him fully now. "You were not outside my door by coincidence," I said, testing the idea out loud as if hearing it would reveal whether it was real. "No," he answered simply. The word was not dramatic. It was final. A quiet silence followed, stretching longer than the previous ones, and I became aware of how little sound existed in my apartment, how even the refrigerator hum seemed distant now. "Then explain it," I said, my voice steadier but thinner than I wanted it to be. Ethan finally stepped just slightly closer to the threshold, not entering, but reducing the distance enough that the air between us felt charged with intention. "You are not the only one who understands patterns," he said. "You only understand yours from the inside." I felt a strange stillness settle in my thoughts at that, not agreement, not denial, but the unsettling possibility that my understanding of everything I had done might be incomplete. "I chose this," I said quietly, though the sentence felt more like something I needed to believe than something I was stating. Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice softened just slightly, not in emotion, but in precision. "No," he said, "you adapted to it." And for the first time since I had opened the door, I could not immediately answer. I remained still longer than I meant to, the words Ethan Callahan had just spoken still hanging in the air like something I could not fully process yet. Adapted. The word repeated itself inside my mind in a way that felt uncomfortable, as if it had been chosen too carefully to be accidental. I turned slightly away from him again, not to escape, but to create space for my thoughts to reorganize. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, not because anything had changed physically, but because his presence at the threshold made every corner feel observed in a way I had not experienced before. "You keep speaking like my life is something you have already studied," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan did not react immediately. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, posture calm in a way that did not suggest hesitation or threat, only certainty. "I do not study people," he said after a moment. "I observe patterns that repeat." I let out a short breath that almost sounded like disbelief. "And I am one of those patterns," I replied. He did not deny it. That silence was more direct than any answer could have been. I walked further into the apartment, stopping near the small kitchen counter, placing my hand on its surface as if the physical contact could anchor me to something familiar. My reflection in the dark window above the sink looked unfamiliar for a second, like someone standing slightly out of sync with their own life. "If you have been watching me," I said carefully, Then you already know I did not want any part of this. Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the room, but toward me specifically, as if separating me from the environment around me. Wanting something and understanding what you are inside of are not the same thing, he said. The statement unsettled me more than I expected it. 2. I turned fully toward him again. You are not answering my question, I said. Why now? A pause followed, longer than the previous ones, and for the first time there was something in his expression that felt less like calculation and more like restraint. Because the distance you created stopped working, he said. I frowned slightly. What does that even mean? Ethan finally stepped forward just one pace, still remaining at the threshold but closer than before, as if choosing precision over intrusion. It means the people you left behind are no longer following the version of you that moved, he said. They are following the trace you never erased. My stomach tightened slightly at the phrasing. I shook my head once, more to dismiss the idea than to physically reject it. There is nothing left to follow, I said. He studied me for a moment, then spoke again with the same controlled calm. That is what you believe, he said. But belief is not structure. The words felt too deliberate to ignore. I stepped back from the counter, crossing my arms without realizing it, trying to regain a sense of control through posture alone. So what are you saying? I asked. That I am not safe here. Ethan did not answer immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any reassurance could have. When he finally spoke, his voice remained steady but lowered slightly, as if acknowledging something unavoidable. I am saying, he replied, that safety is not determined by where you are standing right now. The apartment around me suddenly felt quieter again, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel more intentional. I looked at him for a long moment, trying to find something in his expression that resembled manipulation or exaggeration, but there was nothing performative in the way he stood there. Only certainty, contained and controlled. Then what am I supposed to do? I asked, my voice quieter now, less defensive, more uncertain. Ethan held my gaze without hesitation. You stop assuming distance equals disappearance, he said. And for the first time since he arrived, I realized the most unsettling part was not that he had found me, but that a part of me was beginning to suspect I had never truly been lost. I did not realize how long I had been standing there in silence until the weight of it began to feel like an answer on its own. Ethan Callahan remained at the threshold of my apartment, unmoving in the way that made it clear he was not waiting out of uncertainty, but out of patience that had already accounted for every possible reaction I could give. The words he had spoken moments earlier still echoed in my thoughts, not because they were loud, but because they refused to fade into something I could dismiss. Safety is not determined by where you are standing right now. I repeated it internally, trying to break it apart into something less meaningful, something I could categorize as exaggeration, but it held together too cleanly for that. You are speaking as if my entire life is already mapped out, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected, though it carried less resistance than before. Ethan's gaze did not shift away from me. Not mapped, he replied. Observed. The distinction did not comfort me. I moved slowly toward the small living room area, not because I wanted distance from him, but because I needed something in the room to feel familiar again. The couch, the dim lamp, the faint hum of the heater, all of it suddenly felt like it belonged to a version of my life that I had started questioning without permission. If you have been observing me, I said, turning slightly to face him again, then you already know I have no intention of being part of whatever this is. Ethan did not respond immediately, and in that pause I noticed something new in his expression, not change, but recognition of the exact phrasing I had used. Intention does not override consequence, he said. The sentence landed softly, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I crossed my arms instinctively, as if physical structure could replace internal certainty. You are not explaining anything, I said. You are only stating things like they are already decided. For the first time, he stepped just slightly further into the apartment, though still keeping distance from me, as if the boundary itself was not physical. But understood. They are not decided, he said. They are already in motion. I felt my frustration rise, but it was no longer sharp, more like pressure building under something I could not release. In motion from where? I asked. From my life? Or from yours? Ethan's eyes held steady for a moment longer than before. From both, he said. The answer should have made no sense, but instead it made too much sense in a way I did not want to accept. I turned away briefly, walking toward the window, looking out at the empty street below. Chicago at night always looked quieter than it felt, as if the city was holding its breath between versions of itself. I built something stable here, I said, though it sounded more like reassurance to myself than an argument to him. Ethan's voice came from behind me, calm but precise. Stability is not the same as separation, he said. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words settle without letting them define anything. When I turned back, he was still watching me, not pressing forward, not withdrawing, simply existing in the same certainty he had carried from the beginning. Then tell me what this is really about, I said, my voice lower now, less defensive, more focused. Ethan held my gaze, and for a moment the silence between us felt structured, as if the answer had always been there, but required permission to be spoken. It is about the moment your past stopped being behind you, he said quietly, and started arriving at the same place you did. And in that instant, I understood that nothing about my running had ever been about distance at all. I stayed near the window longer than I intended, watching the street below as if it could offer a version of reality that made more sense than the one unfolding inside my apartment. Ethan Callahan's presence behind me was steady, unchanged, not closer, not farther, but anchored in a way that made it impossible to forget he was there. The silence between us no longer felt empty. It felt structured, like something carefully held in place by words that had already been spoken and could not be taken back. You keep speaking about my past as if it is a separate place, I said, quietly, still facing the window. It is not. Ethan's voice came without hesitation. That is the assumption you were taught to survive with. I turned slightly, enough to see him again in the dim light of my living room. You are speaking in circles, I said, though my voice lacked the sharpness it had earlier. He did not react to the accusation. Instead, he took a slow step further inside, not invading, but no longer waiting at the threshold either. It only feels like a circle when you are inside it, he said. I exhaled slowly, pressing my hand lightly against the glass of the window, as if I needed something cold and real to focus on. Then explain what I am inside of, I said. Ethan's gaze held steady, and for the first time, there was something almost quieter in his expression, not softness, but acknowledgement of weight. You are inside continuity, he said. The words did not immediately make sense, but they refused to disappear. I turned fully toward him again. That does not mean anything to me, I replied. He nodded slightly, as if accepting that. It means nothing to you because you were trained to interpret your life as isolated decisions, he said. Move, change, disappear, repeat. But none of those actions were ever disconnected from what came before. I felt my jaw tighten slightly, not from anger, but from the discomfort of recognition forming without permission. You are talking like someone who has been watching me for years, I said carefully. Ethan did not deny it. He simply said, time is not required for observation. Pattern is enough. I walked slowly back toward the center of the room, putting space between myself and the window, as if shifting position could shift perspective. If everything you are saying is true, I asked, then why now? Why appear at my door in the middle of the night as if I am supposed to understand all of this immediately? Ethan paused, and for the first time, the silence felt less like calculation and more like restraint. Because the point of convergence has already passed, he said. I frowned slightly. Point of convergence, I repeated. He nodded once. The moment where your past stops following you and starts intersecting with you again, he said. My breath slowed without my permission. I looked at him more carefully now, not just at his presence, but at the way he held himself, as if he had already accounted for my disbelief. That is not possible, I said quietly, though it sounded less like rejection and more like something I needed to remain true. Ethan's voice did not rise or soften. It remained steady, anchored. It already happened, he said. The room felt smaller again, not physically, but perceptually, as if every surface had shifted slightly closer. I took a slow step back, not away from him, but away from the weight of what he was implying. Then what happens next? I asked, my voice quieter now. Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and when he answered, it was not a prediction. It was a conclusion already in motion. Now, he said, you stop believing you are still ahead of it. I did not realize how still everything had become until Ethan Callahan stopped speaking. The silence that followed his last words did not feel like absence of sound, but like the absence of direction, as if the room itself was waiting for me to decide what kind of reality I was willing to accept. I stood in the center of my apartment without moving, my thoughts no longer organized into resistance or agreement, but something far more unstable, recognition without permission. Ethan remained where he was, not closer than before, not further away, but present in a way that made the space between us feel intentional rather than accidental. "You are asking me to accept something I cannot verify," I said quietly, my voice controlled but thinner than I wanted it to be. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at me with the same calm focus he had maintained since arriving, as if my hesitation was not unexpected but accounted for. "Verification is not required for structure to exist," he said. I exhaled slowly, turning slightly as if movement could help stabilize the pressure building in my thoughts. "That is not how reality works," I replied. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of my framework. "It is how you were taught to define it," he said. The sentence landed differently than the others. It did not challenge me directly. It suggested that my resistance itself was part of something already anticipated. I walked a few steps toward the couch, not sitting, just lowering myself slightly, as if the change in height could shift perspective. "You keep saying everything is connected," I said, "but I do not see any connection." Ethan's gaze followed me, steady and uninterrupted. "That is because you were never meant to see it from inside the pattern," he said. I frowned slightly, trying to push back against the way his certainty kept reshaping my uncertainty. "Then from where?" I asked. "Am I supposed to see it?" He paused for a brief moment, and for the first time his answer felt less like explanation and more like exposure. "From the point where avoidance stops working," he said. I felt my fingers tighten against the edge of the couch without realizing it. The room felt quieter again, not externally, but internally, as if my ability to dismiss what I was hearing had begun to weaken. "You are making it sound like I never had a choice," I said. Ethan stepped no closer, but his voice carried with a measured clarity that did not allow distortion. "You had choices," he said. "You simply made them within boundaries you never questioned." I looked down for a moment, letting the words sit without reacting to them immediately. The idea should have felt absurd, but instead it felt uncomfortably familiar, like something I had already sensed but refused to articulate. "If that were true," I said quietly, "then what happens to those boundaries now?" Ethan's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in tone when he answered, as if the answer had been prepared long before I asked. "Now you see where they end," he said. I lifted my gaze back to him, and for the first time, I did not respond immediately. The silence between us no longer felt like distance. It felt like arrival. I did not notice at first that I had stopped arguing with him. The realization came quietly, like a shift in air pressure rather than a decision. Ethan Callahan remained where he was, still near the center of my apartment, but everything about the way I perceived that space had changed. It was no longer just my apartment with an unwanted presence inside it. It felt like a space that had been temporarily redefined by information I could not yet classify. I exhaled slowly and looked at him again, trying to find something in his expression that resembled uncertainty or improvisation, but there was none. "If everything you are saying is true," I said finally, my voice lower now, more measured than resistant, "then why do I feel like I am only now hearing about it?" Ethan's gaze remained steady, not shifting toward the room, not distracted by anything around us. "Because awareness is not simultaneous with reality," he said. I frowned slightly, absorbing the sentence rather than rejecting it immediately. The words were structured in a way that made them difficult to dismiss without first understanding them, and that in itself was unsettling. I walked slowly toward the kitchen counter, placing my hand on it again as if grounding myself in repetition. "You are still not telling me what I am supposed to do with this," I said. Ethan did not move closer, but his voice carried with the same controlled clarity as before. "You are not supposed to do anything with it yet," he said. I looked down briefly at the counter, then back at him. "That does not sound like an answer," I replied. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the observation without correction. "It is not an instruction," he said. "It is a transition." The word lingered longer than expected. I turned away slightly, facing the window again, though I was no longer focused on what was outside. The street below remained quiet, indifferent to the conversation taking place above it. But even that normality now felt distant, almost staged. Transition into what? I asked. There was a pause, not dramatic, but precise, as if he was selecting the most accurate phrasing rather than the most persuasive one. Into recognition, he said. I let out a small breath that almost sounded like disbelief. Recognition of what? I asked. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. That the separation you built between your past and your present was never complete. I turned back toward him fully now, my expression tightening slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. I built my life here, I said. That is not separation. That is rebuilding. He studied me for a moment before responding. Rebuilding assumes what was removed no longer exists, he said. I felt a subtle tension rise in my chest again, not panic, but something closer to cognitive resistance. Then what are you suggesting? I asked. That I never left anything behind. Ethan's gaze did not waver. I am suggesting, he said carefully, that what you left behind did not remain behind. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. It did not feel like space between thoughts. It felt like pressure between conclusions. I stood still for a moment longer, then slowly lowered myself into the edge of the couch, not fully sitting, as if uncertain whether stillness was safe or temporary. Ethan remained where he was, no closer than before, but no longer simply at the edge of entry either. He had become part of the room in a way that did not require movement. Then what happens next? I asked quietly. Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice was calm but absolute in its restraint. Now you stop measuring your life by distance, he said, and start understanding what has been following you without needing to move at all. I stayed seated on the edge of the couch without fully committing to stillness, as if even resting my body completely would mean accepting something I was not ready to define. Ethan Callahan remained in the same position inside my apartment, not invading it further, but no longer separated from it either. His presence had shifted from something external to something integrated, like a variable I could no longer remove from the equation. I looked at him carefully now, trying to separate perception from interpretation, but the more I focused, the less difference I could find between the two. You keep speaking as if I am supposed to recognize something that I never agreed to see, I said quietly. Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but his voice carried a steady precision when he responded. Agreement is not required for recognition, he said. I exhaled slowly, my hands resting loosely together in my lap, though I did not remember placing them there consciously. That sounds like control disguised as explanation, I replied. He did not react defensively. Instead, he took a moment before answering, as if considering whether correction would be useful. Control implies removal of choice, he said. What you are experiencing is awareness of structure. I frowned slightly, my gaze lowering toward the floor for a brief moment. The apartment felt quieter again, but not in a comforting way. It felt observational, as if even silence had become part of the conversation. You are still not telling me why you are here, I said, my voice lower now, more grounded but less resistant. Ethan looked at me with the same calm focus that had not shifted since he arrived. I am here because distance has stopped being relevant, he said. The sentence lingered, and I found myself repeating it internally without intending to. I leaned back slightly against the couch, not fully relaxed, but no longer rigid either. That does not explain how you found me, I said. He nodded once, acknowledging the distinction. Finding is not the correct term, he said. Continuing is. I felt a small tightening in my chest at that, not fear exactly, but the discomfort of language being used in a way that bypassed my usual defenses. Continuing what? I asked. Ethan's gaze remained steady, and when he answered, his tone did not change, but the weight behind it became more defined. A sequence that did not end when you believed it ended, he said. I sat quietly for a moment, letting the words settle without immediately reacting to them. The idea of sequence suggested structure, but not necessarily meaning, and that distinction unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I built a life here, I said again, though the repetition now felt less like defense and more like uncertainty. Ethan did not challenge the statement directly. You built a position, he said, not an endpoint. I looked at him more directly now, searching for something that would allow me to classify what I was hearing as metaphor or exaggeration, but his expression remained consistently grounded, without performance or persuasion. "Then what are you saying is happening now?" I asked. He paused for a brief moment, and when he spoke again, the phrasing was slower, as if narrowing the meaning to its most precise form. "What is happening now," he said, "is that the version of your life that relied on separation is no longer sufficient to hold its structure." The silence that followed was no longer empty. It felt like something had been placed inside it deliberately. I lowered my gaze again, not in defeat, but in processing, trying to find the point where interpretation could still override implication. Ethan remained where he was, neither approaching nor withdrawing, as if the conversation itself had already determined proximity. When I finally spoke again, my voice was quieter than before. "And if I refused to accept that?" I asked. Ethan's answer came without hesitation, but without force. "Then you will continue to interpret what is already converging," he said, "until interpretation is no longer sufficient." And in that moment, I understood that nothing in his arrival had been about interruption at all, but about completion of something I had never realized was still in progress. I remained seated as the weight of his last words settled into the room, like something irreversible had already taken place. Ethan Callahan did not move closer, but the space between us no longer felt like distance I could control. It felt like structure I had only recently become aware of. I looked at him carefully, searching for something inconsistent in his expression, something that would allow me to categorize all of this as misunderstanding, but there was nothing to break the continuity of his calm. "You are speaking as if everything I have done led to this exact moment," I said quietly, my voice more controlled than emotional now. Ethan did not respond immediately. When he did, his tone remained steady, as if he was not reacting to my words but continuing a thought that had already existed before them. "Not everything," he said. "Only the parts that were never separate to begin with." I exhaled slowly, pressing my hands together without realizing it, grounding myself in physical repetition. "That is still not an explanation," I replied. He nodded once, acknowledging the limitation of my interpretation rather than challenging it. "Explanation assumes you are missing information," he said. "You are not missing information. You are reorganizing it." The sentence lingered longer than the others. I looked away briefly, toward the dim light of the kitchen, toward anything that felt neutral enough to absorb my thoughts. "If what you are saying is true," I asked quietly, "then what does that make my decisions?" Ethan's gaze did not shift. "Valid," he said, "but not independent." I frowned slightly at that, not in anger, but in the discomfort of hearing something too structured to dismiss quickly. "You keep removing the idea that I had control," I said. "That is not something I can accept easily." For the first time since he arrived, there was a subtle pause that felt less like calculation and more like acknowledgement of consequence. "I am not removing control," he said. "I am redefining where it begins and ends." I leaned back slightly against the couch again, not fully relaxed, but no longer rigid in resistance. The conversation had shifted away from confrontation and into something closer to reconstruction, though I was still not sure what was being reconstructed. "Then where does it begin?" I asked. Ethan looked at me for a moment longer than before, and when he spoke, his answer was quieter, but more definitive. "It begins earlier than you have been allowed to consider," he said. The phrase did not immediately resolve into meaning, but it created a sense of continuity I could not ignore. I pressed my fingers lightly against my forehead for a moment, as if physical pressure could stabilize thought. "You are asking me to accept that my entire life was already part of something else," I said. Ethan did not correct me. "I am asking you to stop isolating it from what it already belongs to," he replied. Silence followed again, but it was no longer empty. It felt occupied, as if each word had left something behind that was still active. I lowered my hand and looked directly at him. "And what happens if I do not accept that?" I asked. Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but his voice softened slightly in precision, not emotion. "Then you remain in a version of your life that will eventually contradict itself," he said. "Not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete." I did not respond immediately. The idea of incompleteness did not feel like accusation. It felt like exposure. I slowly stood up from the couch, not out of urgency, but out of the need to regain physical awareness of the room around me. Ethan remained still, observing without interrupting. I walked a few steps toward the center of the apartment again, then stopped. "So what is this really about?" I asked finally, my voice quieter now than before. Ethan looked at me steadily, and for the first time, his answer did not feel like an explanation or a correction. It felt like arrival. "It is about the moment you realize," he said, "that what you called your escape was never separation at all, but continuation under a different name." And in that silence that followed, I understood that the most unsettling part was not that he had found me, but that nothing in me could confidently say I had ever truly left. I stood in the middle of the room without moving, as if any step in either direction might finalize something I was not yet ready to define. Ethan Callahan remained near the center of my apartment, not as an intruder, not as a guest, but as something closer to an inevitability that had finally taken form. The silence between us no longer felt like distance. It felt like conclusion that had not yet been spoken aloud. I slowly exhaled, forcing my thoughts to stay structured. "If what you are saying is true," I said quietly, "then there is no version of my life that was ever separate from this moment." Ethan did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was steady, not persuasive, not emotional, only precise. "Separation was never the design," he said. I felt a slight tightening in my chest at the word design, not because it was dramatic, but because it implied intention outside of me. I turned slightly toward the window again, though I was no longer looking outside. "Then whose design are you talking about?" I asked. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on me. "Not ownership," he said. "Structure." I let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "You are still not answering in a way that makes this feel real," I said. He nodded once, as if acknowledging that realism was not the standard he was operating from. "Reality does not require comfort to exist," he said. I lowered my gaze briefly, pressing my fingers lightly against the edge of the couch again. The repetition of grounding had become instinctual, as if physical contact could stabilize internal dissonance. "Then why me?" I asked. The question came out quieter than I intended. Ethan did not shift his posture. When he answered, it was not with emphasis, but with clarity that felt already decided. "Because your pattern did not resolve where it was supposed to," he said. I looked at him more directly now, searching for anything that resembled metaphor or exaggeration, but his expression remained consistent, anchored in certainty. "That does not mean anything to me," I said. He took a slow step forward, not closing distance in a threatening way, but aligning himself more fully within the space. "It means you were never removed from observation," he said. I frowned slightly. "Observation of what exactly?" I asked. Ethan paused, and for the first time, the silence felt less like control and more like precision. "Of decisions that were never fully yours," he said. The sentence did not land as accusation. It landed as reclassification. I shook my head once, slowly, not in denial, but in resistance to restructuring. "You are asking me to believe my entire life has been influenced without my awareness," I said. Ethan's tone did not change. "I am asking you to acknowledge that influence does not announce itself," he replied. I turned away slightly again, walking a few steps toward the kitchen counter, placing both hands on it this time. The apartment felt smaller, not physically, but perceptually, as if the boundaries had shifted inward. "And what happens now?" I asked quietly. "If I cannot accept that version of reality?" Ethan remained where he was, but his voice carried clearly through the space. "Then you remain inside a version of events that will eventually collapse under its own inconsistencies," he said. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of exhaustion, but out of the effort required to process without rejecting. When I opened them again, I turned back toward him. "So what is this really about?" I asked. Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words no longer felt like explanation. They felt like final alignment. "It is about the point where denial stops protecting you from what is already established," he said, "and starts separating you from what is still active." And in that moment, standing in my own apartment that no longer felt fully mine, I understood that nothing he had said was introducing something new. It was revealing something that had been operating long before I was ready to name it. I stood still in the center of my apartment, feeling as if the air itself had changed density around me, not heavier in a physical sense, but more defined, like every breath now had meaning I could not ignore. Ethan Callahan remained in front of me, not moving closer, not retreating, but holding a presence that no longer felt like interruption and instead felt like completion of something I had been part of long before I understood it. The silence between us was no longer uncertain. It was settled. I slowly exhaled, my voice quieter than before when I finally spoke. "So what you are saying," I said, "is that I was never actually free from any of this." Ethan did not respond immediately, and in that pause I felt something shift in me, not emotionally, but structurally, as if the way I had organized my understanding of my life was no longer holding its original shape. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, controlled, and entirely without urgency. "Freedom," he said, "requires separation from influence that does not exist in isolation." I looked at him for a long moment, trying to find resistance in myself, something that would allow me to reject what he was describing as interpretation rather than fact, but I could no longer separate the feeling of discomfort from the sense that he was not introducing anything new, only naming what had already been operating. I took a slow step backward, not away from him, but into awareness of my own space, the apartment around me suddenly feeling less like a boundary and more like a frame. "Then what happens now?" I asked quietly. "If I stop resisting what you are saying?" Ethan's gaze did not change, but something in his expression softened into finality rather than explanation. "Then you begin to see sequence instead of isolation," he said. The words did not feel like instruction. They felt like recognition. I lowered my eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in processing something too large to immediately organize into certainty. "And what am I supposed to do with that understanding?" I asked. Ethan took a small step forward, not invading space, but aligning himself more fully within it, as if the distance between us was no longer relevant to the conversation. "You do not do anything with it," he said. "You stop pretending it was never there." The sentence landed differently than anything before it, not because it was louder, but because it removed the need for interpretation. I felt my breath slow, my thoughts no longer arguing against what I was hearing, but reorganizing around it. "So this was never about me running," I said softly, more to myself than to him. Ethan's voice remained steady, almost quiet now. "It was about you arriving without recognizing what arrival meant," he said. I looked up at him again, and for the first time, I no longer felt as though I was trying to understand something outside of me. It felt as if I was remembering something I had been avoiding naming. The apartment was still the same, the light unchanged, the city outside still distant, but nothing in me could return to the earlier assumption that I had been alone in any of it. I finally spoke again, my voice calm in a way that surprised me. "Then what are you now?" I asked. Ethan met my gaze without hesitation, and when he answered, there was no longer ambiguity in his tone. "I am the confirmation," he said, "that what you thought was behind you was never required to follow you at all." And in that moment, standing in the stillness of my own life as it redefined itself without permission, I understood that the most important truth was not that he had found me, but that I had never been outside of reach in the first place.